Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our annual Pupillage panel event. As another reminder, if everyone could please keep their cameras off and microphones muted for the duration of the session. We will have an opportunity at the end for questions and answers, at which point you'll be welcome to come on screen. So we're very excited to have everyone here. I'd like to start by thanking our panelists for generously giving up their time this evening. And I'll begin by introducing each of our speakers. So we have Selva Ramasamy Casey, who is Joint Head of Chambers at QEB Hollis Whiteman. Selva is also a bencher at the Inner Temple, and he also happens to be the Master of the Racial Equality Society. We also have Bibi Badejo. She is the Joint Deputy Head of Chambers at Four Brick Court, an accredited advocacy trainer at the Inn, and the founder of the Advocacy Coach. Our next speaker will be Sally Hobson, who is a highly experienced senior criminal barrister who works predominantly in complex criminal matters. Sally is a Grade 4 CPS prosecutor. Up next, we have Nia Marshall, who became a tenant of Exchange Chambers in September 2024. Nia has a busy practice in personal injury and employment law, and she uses her YouTube channel, Life Law BIM, and the International Future Barristers Mentorship Scheme to support aspiring barristers, particularly those from international backgrounds. Next, we have Hafsa Hussain, who is a member of Park Square Barristers. Hafsa has a broad practice including crime, personal injury, and clinical negligence. And finally, we have Michael Brooks Reed, who is a pupil barrister at Temple Garden Chambers. Michael previously worked as a judicial assistant at the Court of Appeal. With us tonight, we also have members of the Executive Committee of the Racial Equality Society. They'll be able to assist throughout the duration of the session. So I'll now hand over to our speakers to talk a bit about their journey to the bar and to offer their advice to those applying for pupillage this year. And so we'll start with Selva. Selva, over to you.
Tamina, thank you. Thank you for those introductions. Good evening, everybody. And before I say any more, I'd like to say thank you to everyone on the Racial Equality Society who's put hard work into organising this event. Nothing like this existed when I was applying for pupillage, as you can tell from my grey beard, quite a long time ago. And I wish it had existed. It would certainly have made things a lot easier. And I hope this sort of thing makes things easier for all of you in your quest for pupillage over the coming months and years. So I was called to the bar in 1992. As you can imagine, the process applying for pupillage back then was different to the way it's run now. I sat down and wrote something like 80 letters by hand, and I put them into envelopes and I stuck stamps on them and I put them in post boxes and I waited for letters to come back. That was how it was in those days. It's obviously much more focused now with the gateway, and actually I think the quality of applications has gone up as a result. You have to think a lot more about what you want to do, and certainly my experience from interviewing people who apply to my chambers is the quality of applicants and applications has increased, so that's a good thing. So I'm not going to talk much about my experience of applying because it was a long time ago. Instead, I'm going to speak about my experience as someone who has sat on interview panels in my chambers over many, many years. The things I've seen which work and help, the things I've seen which perhaps don't work so well, and importantly, how people can improve their prospects. The first thing I'll say to all of you is I think this process is about resilience as much as anything else. It's a competitive process. Any job that's worthwhile is going to have a competitive process as part of its selection proceedings. And that makes complete sense. Chambers are looking for the best. That's why we have these processes of interviewing, etc. There is no reason at all why any of you should not succeed if you put your mind to it. And that's an important thing to bear in mind for all of you listening today. The reason I mention resilience is if you're going to go into it, you need to be ready for a no, because that is the experience that many, many people will get, certainly first time round. And a lot of people will end up applying two, three, four times. So be ready for a no and do not take that as a sign of disaster. My experience is a lot of people who apply first time round, their forms are okay, but they haven't really got into the role of it. They haven't really developed quite enough experience to really show their best. And of course, you learn from having been through it once. Your interview skills get better. You get a bit of feedback here and there, and you learn how to polish your application all the more. So be ready for a no and do not take no as a sign of disaster. Just roll with the punches. If that's what comes your way, it will have happened to many, many successful barristers before you, and it's going to keep happening, just as it does out there when anyone applies for a good job. First time round, they might get knocked back. Get back in the saddle and keep at it. If you do get to know, the important thing is to look at where you think you might have fallen short in the application and to look over the next year or so to fill those gaps, to develop those skills, and to be constantly improving your application so that next time round it looks better. You've learned from the experience. And there are lots and lots of ways of filling time. If you get a no and you have to go again, yeah, paralegaling jobs, voluntary work, all sorts of things you can do, which might just give you that really good hook to show neighbors, look at what I did in that year or that 6 months to help people to improve as an advocate, to improve my legal skills. And my experience is that quite often people who've had a year or two between bar school and applying for pupillage end up with much better looking forms because they've filled those pages with experience and real stuff rather than hypotheticals, which is kind of how my application form looked. So resilience, be ready for a no and don't take it as disaster. It happens to so many people who end up with fabulous careers at the bar. The next question is where to apply. Now, do your research. The internet is your friend. It's a resource which didn't exist at all when I was applying for pupillage, but now you can get out there and Google away and find out about different types of chambers and different types of work. Talk to people. Try and get yourself a mentor or a friendly lawyer who can help you with discussions about where you might want to apply and what sort of work you might want to do. And obviously, get out there and do as many mini pupillages and placements with solicitors' firms, marshalling with judges. Try and build up. It's not just experience on the CV, it's also going to help you to think, I quite like the way that type of law looks. I quite like the way that it feels. It feels familiar to me. So be willing to do the research. And remember, a lot of chambers, when they interview, they're going to say, well, why are you applying to a criminal law set of chambers? Why are you applying to a commercial law set of chambers? What's it about this area of law? And if you can back it up by saying, well, I've spent a bit of time doing this kind of law, by way of experience, I've spent a bit of time in court watching. I did my dissertation in this, whatever it is, showing that you've got a real reason to be interested in that area. You're going to be asked those questions, so be ready to answer them. I also think it's worth spending some time, if you want to be a barrister, getting some experience of how solicitors go about their work, because a lot of chambers will ask you, why do you want to be a barrister rather than a solicitor? And all the more now, of course, when really solicitors can do an awful lot of what we do as barristers, certainly in terms of advocacy, if one gets higher rights. So be ready to answer those sorts of questions. And you can only really answer them if you've gone out and done your research in advance. Your application form. Well, what to put in it? Now, there's all sorts of information on the internet, and I really do commend to all of you getting out there, doing your research, reading things that Inner Temple have put out there by way of guidance and other chambers have put out there to help you with thinking about what to put onto your form. But in terms of experience, try and put as much in there as possible. And obviously, legal experience can be mini pupillages and placements and marshalling, but it can also be voluntary work and thinking back to things you might have done as a student, law centers, anything involving advocacy, mooting, debating, anything like that. The more you have, the better your form is going to look. But remember, it doesn't have to be only legal experience. I think some of the best forms also show people are demonstrating by jobs they've done totally outside of the setting of law, but they can demonstrate they are organized, they are confident, they are compassionate, they want to help people, they can face challenges. So think about how you can use your non-legal work experience to demonstrate skills which are relevant to the things that we as barristers do. So legal and non-legal experience, try and ace that. In terms of the style, you will be familiar with what's called the STAR approach, so situation, task, action, result. It is a useful way of trying to get your form set out in a way which is going to help the person that's reading it. And importantly, if you're using the STAR approach, situation, task, action, result, try to focus more on the last two of those, so the action and the result. Action, what did you do about the situation and the task? Result, how did it play out? What did you manage to do for the person you were helping or the situation you were trying to resolve? So it's quite a useful way of trying to set things out clearly using the STAR approach. In terms of format, try and make it as clear as possible. Certainly, think about the chambers, the people who will be reading your form. Now, they're going to get hundreds of applicants. And if your form is nice and clear, it's laid out in a way which helps the person to understand what you're saying, it's going to be a lot easier for them rather than just a paragraph densely packed full of words with no obvious structure. So think about bullet points and headings. Help the person who's reading your form to understand just how good you are. And importantly, proofread your form. Do it several times because typos and errors will be noticed. We are a job where precision matters. So do make sure you proofread, check, recheck, and check again. The last thing I'm going to say to you before I pass on to others is the interview. Try and get some practice if you can. The Inn offers some assistance, and obviously you can go onto the website and find that. And quite a few chambers will also offer assistance to people who are preparing for their interviews. Everything in life gets easier with practice. And if I go back to where I started with resilience, if you're one of those people, one of the many, many people who has to go again because you get a no first time or second time round, remember that each time that you get an interview, even if you get a no at the end of it, that is practice. It means the next time you go for an interview, it's less intimidating. It's more familiar. You know sort of how it's going to go. So treat everything as experience on the pathway to you hopefully securing your pupillage. What I say to all of you is, I'm really pleased that you've joined this. I'm pleased you're interested in our profession. It is a wonderful job. I encourage you all to keep at it, to be resilient, and you all have my very best wishes for your future careers. I'm going to pass on now. I'll pass you back to Tamina, I think, who will let us know who's speaking next. Tamina, thank you.
Thank you, Selva. That's some really valuable advice there. So up next we have BB. BB, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, and lovely to see everybody, or rather, I can see your names. I can't see you, but it's great to have you here. So I thought I would give you some practical tips, and not too many, something that I think that you'll be able to incorporate. And let me just start off first with telling you about my journey to the bar. Now, I how long ago I went there, and I remember going into my class and finding out that four people already had pupillage, and that was incredibly intimidating because pupillage seemed so far away. And we had people who were like the top 10 debaters in the country. They were incredibly bright, and I just didn't know how to compete with them. And what Selva has said about resilience is very, very true. Because I was called in 2005, and I didn't get pupillage until 2008 to start in 2009. And every single time I was getting those rejections, it made me desperately unhappy because I felt that I wasn't good enough, but I kept on trying. Now, the experience. So I worked for an agency where I was sent out to court as a clerk, and I would be able to do advocacy as a solicitor's clerk, applying for mortgage repossessions, which wasn't great. I didn't love it because people tended to cry a lot when I went to court. But then that also led to me doing some voluntary work for Greenwich Housing Rights, and I would be able to act for tenants as well in front of district judges. And what this did was give me incredible advocacy experience. And it also meant that I had a lot to put on my form as well. So when it came to that wonderful round of pupillage applications, I had one interview. It was about 10, 15 minutes. I was laughing in it, so that sounded good. And I got it. So it was absolutely amazing. And it sounds absolutely magical. But I have to say that there was a lot of hard work that went behind that. So let me just tell you what that hard work was. It was about identifying what my weak like them, but then it was even worse. They were my arch enemy, my nemesis. And the reason why was mainly because I didn't like the pressure that I was under. When I was under pressure, when I was under pressure, I just couldn't think. And the panel would be speaking to me in English, and I would hear the words, but I just felt that I couldn't understand what they were saying, and I couldn't respond in the way that I wanted to. So the way that I dealt with that was by speaking to a few friends, four trusted friends, and I called them my squad, and we would practice interviews, and they would have a list of questions for me, and they would grill me. I asked them to be hostile because I wanted to be able to get through an interview that was difficult, so I wasn't thrown. And they would be really tough. But what they would also do is give me feedback and tell me what worked and what didn't work. So getting this different range of feedback, meaning that I knew what looks good, meant that I could lean into that and also what I could let go of. So it was really impactful. And I have to say, what that meant was that I was able to present as confident and also relax a bit more and engage. So that fear about being under pressure and also about not knowing what to say or not having that space in my head because I was too inside my head, that disappeared. And that was just a level of practice that I was doing. And the sorts of things that I would say is you don't just practice once, you do it a few times. I think I got my squad to interview me about four times and it became increasingly harder. The other thing that I also thought was great about that is because there was that practice element and the familiarity that Selva has just alluded to, it just meant everything went so much smoothly. So when I refer to that interview in which I had laughed and that I was able to answer the questions and be effective, I put it all down to that. And that was just identifying my weakness and having a plan to deal with that. Now, of course, before you get to an interview, what you want to do is have a really great and solid application. And another thing that I would say that you could look at is that using the STAR approach and pulling out your skills as much as possible. The reason why I say this is because you're very likely amazing and you've got incredible skills, but can you make that shine out when someone's reading? Always remember that the markers are working barristers, they're probably busy. They probably have about 20 other applications to mark, so you want yours to stand out. And the way that you can do that is by drawing out your skills as much as possible. I spoke to a mentee earlier this year, and he had explained to me that he had taught about 6 classes over 5 days for a term. And I thought, okay, that sounds interesting, very fine. But when I probed more, I found out that he was teaching 70 teenagers 6 times a day, which is about 420 people, which I think is astonishing, incredibly impressive. So by just asking those questions and getting those figures out, he was able to be even more impressive and demonstrate how he stands out from other people, because I'm sure that's not a common achievement that people undertake. So look for the skills that you can talk about. Maybe think about how you can quantify them and use them as words so it stands out in your application. The other thing I would say in your application, Selva pointed out on saying why you want to work in a particular area. That's incredibly important. The other thing as well is why do you want to work or why do you want pupillage in that particular set of chambers? Because what you don't want to do is have some generic answer. That doesn't help and it doesn't give you the point that I think you should get. So look on the website, obviously, but look at the cases that people are doing. Are there any reported cases that you're interested in? If so, mention them. If you've been fortunate enough to do a mini pupillage, then speak about that and who you met and so on. Or perhaps you've done a work experience in a solicitor's, a vacation scheme, and also come across a barrister there. So you can just talk about that and make it individual and it stands out as well. So those would be the tips that I have for you in terms of your application. Now, the final area that I wanted to speak to you about is what to do as a pupil. So you've got there, you've got your pupillage, what makes a good pupil? And for me, I think it's because of my Nigerian background. I just thought to myself, I need to pretend or behave as if I'm in my auntie's house. And the reason why I said that is because that meant I would be on my best behavior. Otherwise, my mum would kill me if she found out that I hadn't been on my best behavior. So it was please, thank yous, trying to be as helpful as possible, not getting in the way, being proactive, asking intelligent questions, and also if they're dumb questions, that's absolutely fine as well. But just being as helpful as possible, being diligent as possible as well. And those are the things that make a good barrister and also an excellent pupil too. So I hope those have been helpful in terms of practical tips and things that you can incorporate and they help you in your journey.
Thank you, BB. That was some great advice for all of our audience members. Next up, we have Sally. So Sally, over to you.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I'm going to try not to repeat what's already been said to you, but starting with where you are at the moment and asking yourselves, what do I want to do with the rest of my career as a barrister? Do your research, decide what you want to do, go to court, have a look at what other people do, ask yourselves, is this the right career path for me, despite the fact that you are where you are at the moment? Is it actually what you want to do? It is a hard job. It can be a wearing job, and it can be an extremely demoralizing job a lot of the time. But for those of us who succeed at it, it can be incredibly rewarding. But you have to get it right at the beginning, and many of us don't. It's not fatal to the rest of your career. If you don't get it right, you can switch to different practice areas. You can switch chambers. You can have periods where you don't actually practice as a barrister. You can go off. You can do lots of other things that will bring you experience and come back to it. And so what I would advise all of you is take some long, hard thoughts before you enter the pupillage process. And I don't know whether any of you have actually started it and been through it and got rejected already. If you have, that will be one of the demoralizing experiences that you have. It's all what we would say character building for when you go into court or when you enter into practice. You'll have very many more demoralizing experiences. It might sound as if I'm trying to put you off. I'm not. I'm just being realistic about a job which is a career path for us and whether it's right for you. I'm at the 36 group and part of the pupillage committee and also a pupil supervisor. We do a blind sift when we do our pupillage application sifts. And that means that when we look at each and every of the hundreds of pupillage applications that we get, we don't know your name, we don't know your gender, we don't know where you've been to university, we know very little about you other than what you put on the form. And that's why it's so incredibly important to put information on the form which is going to stand out. We tend to look at applicants and what they can add to our chambers. And again, I am repeating what's been said already about research that you do. If you have done your research into the chambers that you want to go to, those who are looking at your pupillage applications will know that. It's also incredibly important to do your research about the people that are likely to be going to do the pupillage sift and are likely to be doing the interviews in due course. Get to know your audience, who they are, and incorporate that onto your form. But most importantly, and the thing that I have learned over many years of doing the pupillage sifts, is get yourself a mentor to help you with this process. There are so many barristers out there, so many people who are willing to help you get your pupillage and get the pupillage that you actually want, rather than it being a pupillage that you're offered because you haven't got the pupillage that you want. I mentored a young lady by the name of Konstantina Nuka last year. I don't know whether any of you are aware of her, but she is a disabled young lady, and she has overcome so many obstacles to get her pupillage that it's quite astonishing. If you look her up on LinkedIn, you will see that she's somebody who travelled from Greece with her parents at a young age. She didn't speak any English. She learned to speak English, but she also had to deal with a disability that was becoming increasingly worse as the years went on. She has muscular dystrophy and is confined mainly to a wheelchair. She also has to carry around with her an oxygen tank. She did lots of mini pupillages where she found it difficult to go into court buildings because they are not designed to be user-friendly for somebody like Konstantina. But her greatest disappointment was going to an interview with a very good set in London and being asked how she thought she would be able to get from one court in a morning on one side of London to another court the other side of London in the afternoon. Now, I don't think it's a question that she ought properly to have been asked, but she answered it in a way that I was so proud of. She said, I'd get a taxi like anybody else. But she knew then that set of chambers was looking at the wheelchair that she was in and looking at the obstacles that they thought she was going to face, rather than looking at the person that was sitting in front of them and what it had taken her to get to where she was, the obstacles that she'd overcome already, the resilience that she had, and the sheer brilliance of somebody who was able to do that and present herself in a good set of chambers for an interview. Now, they didn't offer her a pupillage, but I don't think she'd have accepted it if they had. She's now in pupillage at Nexus Chambers. She was an absolute delight to mentor. And as I mentored her, it became evident that what a lot of people don't do is look at themselves when they are presenting themselves as a prospective pupil. And by that, I mean, they don't look in the mirror and look at what everybody else is going to see. And so I asked Konstantina, when she was practicing answering pupillage questions, practicing the practical exercises that she would inevitably be asked to engage in, to look at herself in the mirror as she was doing that, to look at what other people would be seeing as she did that, to do the same exercise with members of her family, with her friends, practice, 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 until you perfect the answers that you want to give. and you present yourself as the person you want other people to see. And so I think that is a really useful piece of information to people, because you don't always see yourself as other people do. Obviously, when we're on a Zoom meeting, you get to look at yourself all the time, and I'm not sure I really like that. But it's a good exercise to do, because you will work out as you're doing that what you're doing wrong, or your facial expressions, whether you're umming and ahhing, whether you're repeating the same words. And on that topic, increase your vocabulary as much as you can. Do that, because it will help you in an interview where you're expected to impress people, not just by what you're saying, the way you're saying it, and the vocabulary that you're using. So I would ask you all to seriously consider getting a mentor and looking in the mirror. And once you get your pupillage, the pupillage that you want to get, again, think about the pupil that you want to be. When I did my pupillage many, many years ago, I undertook a civil pupillage for my first 6 months. And my pupil master took me down to London, and we were in a temporary court. It was an old embassy that was being used because the court was out of action. And my pupil master, as we used to call them, was really heavily into architecture, and I wanted to impress him in this building. So as he went to find out which court we were going to appear in, I decided to have a look around the building and to look at various aspects of architecture. And as I did so, I noticed on the floor an old electrical switch point on the skirting board. I put out my foot and I switched the electric switch to on. It had been off. And the building fused, all the lights went out, the alarms went on. And I went back to sit in the seat where my pupil master had left me as he went to find out where we were meant to be. He came to find me and ushered me out of the building. And to this day, I've never told him that I was responsible for what must have been just several £1,000s of wasted taxpayer money as they vacated the building, thinking that there had been a bomb threat. I'm telling you all of this so that you know not what to do, but what to do in the event that you do something like that. When you do have disasters during pupillage, don't think that it is the end of the world. It's not. Carry on. Speak to people in your chambers. Find out where you can go to help. The world is a very different place to the one it was when I did my pupillage. And I really wish that there had been somebody that I could have spoken to about that incident. There wasn't, but I survived it. And I went on to obtain tenancy and then moved through various chambers to number 36, where I am at the moment. So I hope that's all been very helpful. And if it hasn't, slightly entertaining. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Some great anecdotes in there from your journey. So up next we have Nia.
Thank you. I must say it's been very entertaining and insightful listening to my fellow co-panelists. Just a bit about myself so that you understand my journey and the context in which I'm going to provide some of these useful tips. I am a Barbadian. I've been born and raised in Barbados, and I moved to the UK to pursue my undergraduate studies and my postgraduate studies. Now, the thing is, throughout my legal tuition, I kept being told effectively that the bar wouldn't necessarily be for me, given that I am an international applicant. Effectively, maybe I should apply to become a solicitor, because solicitors' firms generally have HR departments, and chambers wouldn't have time to deal with all the paperwork that I'd probably bring along. And initially I started to feel quite deflated about it, but then I decided, right, okay, just as I'm about to start my bar course studies, I'm going to start a YouTube channel, and it's called Life Law BIM. And it really is a really, really insightful channel, if I must say so myself, which assists aspiring barristers, both who are UK domiciled and also of international backgrounds. And just to pause right there, I think looking around and just determining and making sure that you know that nobody else has the power to tell you who you can become or what you can pursue. You know, you have to know what you want to do, and you've got to be resilient, determined, and fearless, even though you feel a little bit of fear creeping in. So I started that YouTube channel. I was able to interview a lot of different barristers and people in law, and that helped me to start kind of networking within the bar, and it placed me in a unique position to really start learning and absorbing other people's stories. Then after I finished the bar course, effectively, I started working as a county court advocate for approximately 9 months, and I secured pupillage during that time. Now, after I secured pupillage, I also kind of took stock about the challenges that impacted me as an international applicant. And I decided I'm going to start international future barrister mentorship. And effectively, we have a mentorship program now for international applicants, the first really in England and Wales. I didn't have anything like that when I was coming up, when I was studying. And it just felt almost like I was just kind of wandering and a bit aimless without that structure in place. So I went ahead and I started it. But I would say that what kept me grounded was definitely things like mentorship from other people at the bar. My mentor, I have a mentor, still do have that mentor, and he was amazing. Andrew Powell, actually, is his name. And he continues to play a key role. Now, after I started at IFBM, I took a gap year and I went home. And then I came back and I started pupillage in 2023 and then tenancy by September 2024. Now, you probably wonder why I've also shared that with you, but I think personally that it's important to begin marketing yourself and developing a brand. Why do I say that? You will ultimately be your own business, your own mini business in chambers. Yes, you're going to be part of a chambers if you decide to undertake the self-employed bar, but you also want to start seeing yourself in that light. And when you see yourself that way, it will automatically remind you of your self-worth and how invaluable you are. So when you start evaluating and really assessing yourself in that way, it will help you on those days where you feel doubt creeping in. And it also will help you when you go forward to make your applications, because you will have to select which chambers you want to apply to. And you want to be thinking, you know, does the chambers that I'm applying to, does that chambers have a similar ethos to me? And when you acknowledge and act on your self-worth, you would no longer have a scattergun approach to your applications and a desperation in terms of, I just want pupillage anywhere. Oh my gosh, just give it to me. Anywhere, I'll just take it. No, you start to know, right, this is what I have in mind for myself. And I can also see myself working really well at this particular set because they have very similar ethos to me. In terms of obstacles to overcome, I know for sure, especially from an international background, when you're noting your grades, this is a really practical point. When noting your grades or any exceptional opportunities on a form, particularly those that are from abroad, please ensure that you briefly explain it. Your achievement will be lost on a panel if they don't understand how meaningful it is. So make sure you explain it. Any kind of grading system that is not from within the UK, it's not a within the UK grading system, you must explain it. Don't just put it there and assume that the panel will know. As BB would have said earlier, the panel is busy. There are a lot of busy barristers, and if they've only got a set time to look at your application, you don't want to have someone trying to research to try to understand what your grade or your exceptional opportunity really means. I'll also say as well, you've got to identify your transferable skills, especially if you've got work experience or volunteer experience from your home country, and you're trying to wonder, or you're wondering, how is this going to really be relevant here? I'm telling you, there are some transferable skills. You just need to identify it and note it, and also explain how it's going to be relevant to a career at the bar. That can also be applicable to non-legal work experience. I always tell my own mentees, there's always something that's transferable. And all the time, whenever they explain their role, like, oh, well, I'm just this or I'm just that, I stop them and I say all the time, you're never just anything. And look, I've already found this skill, which will also work at the bar as well. So always make sure that you're identifying your transferable skills. For those of you who are international applicants and listening out there, do not hide your status as an international applicant. Please own it, and please boldly put it in your application form. There's probably going to be a section at the end, specifically maybe asking about your right to work. Even if there isn't, make sure that you put it in the, there's usually a box, I think, for extra information. Pop it in there, and don't forget to put in the Home Office mandate minimum requirement. For those of you who don't know what that means, international applicants cannot accept pupillage on a skilled worker visa unless it is £36,680. That amount keeps going up all the time, because when I applied, I believe it was £20,270. So you can see immediately that you have to be pinpointing the places, the chambers, which already meets that award. But the reason I tell you to put it there is because I received multiple offers for pupillage. And I do remember that the chambers that didn't quite have it, they always knew from the inception and from my application form that I always flagged, I'm Barbadian, I require a skilled worker visa in order to undertake pupillage. And in order to undertake pupillage, I can only accept an award of X because of Home Office rules. And so when I was being made an offer, when I received an offer from them, it was always, Nia, we'd be glad to have you, and we are willing to increase the award so that you can accept the offer. I'm not saying that all chambers will do that, but if you start, you prepare your applications in a transparent way, at least chambers will know, and both of you effectively wouldn't be wasting each other's time. But you can also email the relevant chambers as well and ask them particularly about their awards if you are concerned about effectively wasting time applying to a chambers that you think ultimately you can't accept pupillage at. I also want to give you a few practical tips as it pertains where applicants can go wrong at the paper sift stage, or where I believe applicants can go wrong at this paper sift stage. Now, we're all kind of guilty of it. I know certainly I was when I was first writing my applications. I delved into a lot of description. Now, we all have similar experiences, mini pupillages, debating, mooting, that kind of thing. But to really take your application to the next level, you need to reflect. A reflection calls for analysis of each work experience. So pinpoint the lessons learned and understand how each lesson will assist you in a career at the bar. I recommend all of my mentees that they have a reflective journal where they note all of their work experiences. So you begin with a brief description, which could be literally bullet points, 2 or 3 bullet points. And then you extract the lessons. And as I said, in identifying those lessons, you began analyzing, which takes your application to a level which is usually above quite a few candidates. So really start reflecting, really start thinking, what lesson have I received from this particular experience, which I believe will assist me in my career at the bar. In terms of changes that I implemented personally, I think we've heard a lot about resilience. And for me, I think this helps whether or not you're a spiritual person or a non-spiritual person. I personally believe in God, and I began viewing rejection as a sign of redirection. And I really began deeply trusting that every setback is really preparing me for success. So once you start to understand that every setback is there really shaping you, so that when you start to step into those opportunities, you'll be ready. It really shapes and changes your perspective when you hear those no's. And I'll close now with just telling you what I believe makes a good pupil. One, I think you need to be open-minded and willing to learn new areas. You may actually be surprised to learn about practice areas that you never even knew existed. Two, I'd say deliver on all of your tasks. Aim to meet all deadlines, and if you realize that you're unable to meet a deadline, notify your supervisor and or the barrister who the piece of work is for, and let them know as early as possible. Explain the circumstances, and also suggest a more feasible deadline, but you always want to deliver. And I'd say, thirdly, be discerning. You'll need to hone that skill anyway as a barrister. Start now. I know this is really, really practical, but don't get caught up in any chambers gossip. Occasionally, you may hear other colleagues discussing something that may not even be meant for your ears. Once you ascertain that it doesn't impact on your safety or the safety of others, just mind your business. Learn to hear and don't hear, and see and don't see in certain respects, and just crack on with what it is you need to do. Remember that you're still learning chambers. Listen more than you speak, all right? And don't forget to attend chambers events, all right? Attend chambers events. You really want to get yourself wrapped up into the culture and the fabric of chambers. Thank you very much for the opportunity, everybody.
Thank you, Nia. Some fantastic advice there, particularly for members of the audience from international backgrounds. So Hafsa, we'll hand over to you next.
Thanks, Tamina. I've really enjoyed listening to everyone's advice, and I've learned a lot myself too. And lots of the points my fellow panelists have spoken about that I don't want to go over. So I'm going to just touch on the main points. And then if there's anything that any of the audience want me to expand on, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat and I can expand on them. Because I'm conscious I don't want to eat into our Q&A time. So in terms of my journey, I am from Yorkshire, and I went to Leeds University. I lived there as well, and did a lot of community work in Leeds and in the north. And that community work I actually volunteered with for about 5 or 6 years throughout uni, and then got a job with the police at West Yorkshire Police. So it was doing prosecution team admin, and essentially sending case files to the Crown Prosecution Service at the pre-charge stage. And that kind of gave me an insight into how criminal cases are sort of built right from the start. And then I did a role which was a bit more advocacy focused. It was still with West Yorkshire Police, and it was a domestic violence protection order role, which involved presenting domestic violence protection orders at the magistrates court, and you're representing the police, and it was the first sort of advocacy facing role that I had. But in my applications, I still reference a lot of my community work and the sort of public speaking side of that, and speaking on behalf of young people as advocacy experience. So I'd really stress that, even I know it's difficult to find experience where you are speaking in court, whether it's counter-court advocacy or something similar to what I did with the police. It's quite hard to actually get that experience when you've come out of uni. I know that those sort of roles are not always available everywhere, but don't discount the sort of public speaking roles that you do have, or any time where you've spoken on behalf of someone, and like link that to the same skill. So that's one thing that I would stress, and that kind of came about organically. But I do know the difficulty that people have with referencing that in their applications. But I can expand on that if you need, in terms of further examples. So that's kind of how I eventually ended up with getting pupillage. But what I've realised, and I think a lot of the speakers have picked up on that too, is especially the point about rolling with the punches that Selva mentioned, I definitely did that in the first few years of applying. I think I did about 3 solid rounds. I did a round on the bar course and during the final year of my degree, but that was just sort of testing the waters. And what I think really helped was doing a lot of mock interviews, reaching out to the inns and really getting interview experience, no matter where you get it from, in any shape or form, even if it's someone that isn't particularly linked to law, a family member or a friend, a critical friend that can kind of go through your application and be very sort of not tough with you, but just push you on what it is that you think, what skills you have that will make you a good barrister. And that really helped, I think, from getting first round interviews to second round interviews was the mock interview and experience that I had. Because for a few years, I think I just had first round interviews, and I was thinking, how do I get a second round? I don't see what the jump is to get to that. But it was when I took the time to really look at my application and think about my journey. And as cliche as it sounds, when you have confidence in the narrative of how you've got to where you are, and you're able to articulate that in a persuasive way, and really believe that will make you a good barrister, and the skills that you've extracted from your journey, that's when I started to see the difference. And you only get to that point when you really sit down and look at all the experiences that you've had. Look at the true motivation that that drives you to apply for pupillage, and that gives you that resilience of applying if you've been rejected before, and trying to sort of harness that in your application in a way that shows that you're committed to that career path, because it is a very long process. People say, it's a marathon, not and you have to constantly check what the motivation is for pursuing the career, and only you'll have all your unique reasons for pursuing it. But I think when I kind of became confident in articulating that, and had the mock interviews and really kind of grasped what it was that led me to that conclusion, that's when I started to see the jump. So in terms of answering a question that I'm sure a lot of you have in your mind is, how do I turn my application into an interview, a first round interview, and then a first round interview, a second round interview? It was doing that exercise. Again, I can expand on that if you need in terms of the Q&A. And in terms of, let me see, what would be the most useful point to pick out? Okay, so in terms of the paper sift stage, if you're drafting your applications and you're thinking, I don't know what I need to do to stand out, a lot of the time the word counts are very short. So I would say just approach it with an evidence-based approach. I know that we've heard mention about the STAR techniques, and that's really, really helpful. And if you can say something in 10 words rather than 50, do that. And I know it's easier said than done. But everyone that is going through this process, you'll have such amazing insights and experiences. It's just about how you deploy that information to try and lead with the evidence base, and rather than saying something to it's hard to say without an example. I should have brought an example with me. But when you look through your application, if you've said a point, but there's no sort of evidence base behind that, there's no way that you can, hang your hat on hook and say, this is why I've come to that conclusion, then rewrite it is what I'd say. But you'll get more familiar when you go through each sentence like that, with that sort of forensic mindset. And in terms of what I think makes a good pupil. So I should start off by saying I've been a tenant now at my chambers in Yorkshire since September 23. So I started pupillage in September 22 to 23. So I'm about a year out of pupillage, a year and 4 months. And what I've learned in that journey, I think the difference between being a pupil and a recent tenant is having that confidence when you're in court to look at a series of issues and having the conviction behind yourself that you're making the decision, and you need to be a safe pair of hands for your client, your lay client, also your professional client, and you need to be able to make a decision and communicate that clearly. Even though you sometimes have moments to make that decision, and you're in court, and it's stressful because it's all on your shoulders. But being a good pupil is being able to say, okay, these are the issues, and I've made this decision because I'm being able to communicate that clearly in a way that others feel confident in your judgment. And that I feel that's very difficult when you first start out to have that, especially when you initially spend the first 6 months with your supervisor, then the second 6 months, obviously you still have your supervisor there if you need any questions to be answered. But realizing that you've kind of stepped into those shoes, and you're making the decision, that is definitely an experience that you will just hone each time. No one has oh, I've got it all figured out now. That's not a milestone that I think anyone ever reaches. You're constantly learning with every case, and there's no shame in asking people for advice, and not just in pupillage, but on the road to pupillage. If you need any advice and you reach out to people to get a sense of what would be the next right step to do. Don't be afraid to sort of ask those questions, because that experience you definitely get over time. I think conference skills as well. So on the bar course, you do learn conference skills, but what really helped me was in pupillage, seeing how my supervisor tackled difficult questions, put clients at ease, especially if you're doing crime and family. Most of the time I do crime and civil, but I do practice in family as well. And a lot of the time, the experience that you bring, especially if you've had a few years before you get pupillage, I do think is valuable, because you are able to relate to others a lot better, especially when you're advising on cases involving children, for example, or criminal matters where it's something that you can bring a certain awareness of an understanding of society, I think, rather than coming straight out of being a student. So I do think that has advantages. So don't be disheartened if it takes a few years, because it did take me a few years. But that experience you can bring, and I think that comes across better when I look at conferences and observing others when I've been doing pupillage, those that had sort of a bit more life experience. I do think you can actually relate very well to clients, particularly if you can empathize with them in certain respects too. I do have some other sort of tips and advice, but it has been covered in the previous presentations, where that we also have one final speaker for the Q&A. So if you have any further questions about my journey, the Northern Bar, the Northeastern Circuit, as well as pupillage application questions, that sort of thing, I'm happy to answer them. But I know between everyone, we've probably hopefully covered quite a lot. So I'll pass on to the next speaker, but you're welcome to ask anything. And thank you for having me.
Thank you, Hafsa. Some really important advice there, particularly for those who do eventually get pupillage. So now handing over to our last speaker for the evening, which is Michael.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Tamina and Rebecca, for organising this event. I am a first six pupil currently at Temple Garden Chambers, which, for those of you who don't know, is a common law set with a particular specialism in PI, Clin Neg, and also public law. Before I get started on what I wanted to talk to you about as a whole, can I start by thanking, in particular, Bibi Badejo for her incredibly valuable and useful advocacy podcast. For those of you who haven't listened to it, I would highly recommend that you do so. I listened to it religiously during the time when I was applying for pupillage, and I will certainly be revisiting it in the near future as time comes to embark on Second Six. I would like to just briefly set out my background, just by way of what I'd like to talk about, my background, and then discuss a couple of tips that may not have been covered, or from my personal perspective with regards to written applications and interviews. And then finally, I will make a point which I'd like to put across about coming from an slightly unorthodox background, as I myself do. So firstly, to my background, I, as you may notice, am not necessarily at the age of a typical pupil. I came from a career as a classical violinist. I was for 15 years working as a freelance classical violinist based in Germany, very often touring throughout the world, performing with various orchestras. I undertook the GDL remotely, whilst financing that through the work that I was doing, and then finally settled in London to do the bar course. In terms of pupillage applications, it was a case of third time lucky for me. The first application that I made was during the bar course. I applied for a handful of sets. I had, I think, 2 interviews, 2 first rounds, and that was the end of the story. Second year, I'd finished the bar course, and I adopted what some have termed a scattergun approach, where I applied to a whole range of different sets from a range of different practice areas. I did somewhat better. I had a good handful of interviews, about 3 or 4 second round interviews, and ended up with a reserve offer, which never materialized, sadly, at the time. And in my third year, I should just go back and say that the reason for my scattergun approach was not necessarily coming from the place of just thinking, please, anyone give me pupillage, I'll go anywhere, although to some extent that was true. But it was also the fact that I wasn't quite sure in which practice area I wanted to end up. But instead of taking a scattergun approach in my third year, I took a more directed approach by applying to sets that offered a broad range of practice areas in themselves. And that way I was able to go to those interviews and show an interest, a genuine interest in having a broad practice. Now, there's already been a lot said, and as others have done, I'll try not to repeat things that have been said. And just as a disclaimer, the advice that I'm giving you is my advice that I'm basing on my personal experience. I don't think that there is any one right answer in this whole process. So firstly, to written applications. The first thing I wanted to say about that is think about which chambers you are applying to. And I think that some may not agree with what I would have to say on this. My advice is to apply to a range of chambers, a broad range. Perhaps you want to be a human rights barrister at Doughty Street or Matrix, and that's fine. By all means, make those applications, but apply elsewhere as well. Apply to a range of sets, and in my experience, more is more often. That's not to say that the applications can be of substandard quality. This process takes time, but the more applications you do, the more chances you have. And in my experience, attending an interview at a place that I had applied for without it being my number 1 choice necessarily, or even number 2 or number 3 choice, I would quite often go to interview having researched the chambers and thought, actually, this is a place that I can really see myself. The other point on that is once you've drafted enough application forms to the chamber specific questions, which obviously do take a lot of time to answer well, you can adapt and reuse a lot of the material that you've drafted for previous applications. But as others have said, do adapt it to the chambers at hand. second point on written applications is remember that there's no right answer to any of these questions. The aim is to present yourself in a way that captures the attention of the reader. Don't be shy. I think sometimes a unique and perhaps even risky answer is more likely to attract the reader's attention than a rather longer, perhaps perfectly technically correct answer. Remember, and this is putting it bluntly, it's not your mum reading the application form. The person reading the application form doesn't have the motivation to extract your virtues when they're hidden within your text. It's a busy barrister with a big pile of applications, probably applying varying degrees of attention. So make yourself shine and make it snappy. Turning to interviews, this is where I felt that I made the biggest improvement over the 3 years that I applied. As others have said, gain experience. Think about what you need to do to make yourself a realistic candidate. Experiences that make you feel like you belong will make the panel feel like you belong. And as others have done, I worked as a county court advocate, and I can highly recommend that as a piece of work experience to do, because essentially what you are doing is what you will be doing in your first months or years of practice. Very simple cases, but going into court and standing before a judge and making submissions. Other things that you can do, as was said, I did work as a year as a judicial assistant at the Court of Appeal. As it happens, I applied for that in the same year as I got pupillage. So my interview was after my pupillage applications. But I think had I done it before doing pupillage interviews, it would have been a very impressive thing to have done. And it certainly gave me plenty of experience, which I think is very relevant to what I'm doing now. Practice interview technique, as people have said. I know that it's been said that the Inns of Court have programs that you can do, family, friends. In my case, I had a few sessions with an advocacy coach, with an interview coach, not someone who was tailored to legal or pupillage interviews, but someone who had a lot of experience with it. And that was an incredibly useful thing to do. If anyone wants the name or recommendation of the person with whom I worked, I'd be pleased to provide that. The last thing I think that made the difference to me in my second, and then even more so in my third year of applications, of interviews, was something that I think is somewhat intangible and a bit difficult to describe. I think it probably comes from the experience that I'd gained, partially both in the things that I'd been doing outside of the pupillage process, but also, as Selva mentioned, the repetition of having done interview after interview. You start to feel more comfortable with the process. I went into interviews in fight mode, not wanting to get through the interview, hoping that it would go okay, but grabbing the bull by the horns and going in, wanting to prove my capabilities and my worth, and to the extent that I even occasionally enjoyed interviews. And I think if you enjoy the interview, the panel is likely to as well. The next point that I wanted to just briefly mention is coming from an unorthodox background, like being a violinist in an orchestra. Some of you may be in a similar situation, may come from a variety of different backgrounds, where you may find it difficult to convince sets of your potential to be a barrister. All I would say is that it is not a disadvantage in any way. Obviously, you have to persuade the chambers where you're applying of your commitment to the bar, and you need to sell, as has been said, your transferable skills. But a member of Chambers who sifted my paper application and was on my interview panel in my first round said to me specifically recently that he remembers sifting my application. He remembers it standing out because almost all the applications that he looked at are full of people who've done well at uni, who've done well at school, who have good grades. He was looking for something different and something unique. So just to the final word, it's rather surreal sitting here and speaking to you from the other side. The difference between where I'm sitting and where you're sitting, I can imagine, appears to you to be huge. It's not. Being unsuccessful doesn't mean that you're going to be a bad barrister or that you're not going to be a barrister. Being successful doesn't mean that you're going to be a good barrister. The pupillage application process is imperfect, but it is what it is. And I really hope that what you've heard tonight might shift the balance in your favor. But just remember, you have to want it, you have to fight for it, and you have to go into interviews believing that you have it and that you belong, and that will show. Good luck, everyone, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. That was some really helpful advice for everyone there. So we will pause the recording now.